Martin Cousins caught up with Owen Ferguson. Owen works for Good Practice and they've just released their annual Learning Trends report. And Martin wanted to ask him a few questions about it.
I'm delighted to welcome Good Practice's Owen Ferguson today onto the show. Owen, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but we're really delighted to have you because you've just produced your 8th Learning Trends Index report, and I've had a good nose through that, and it's a really interesting report. So viewers may or may not be aware of it. So really, I'd just like you to introduce you, a bit about Good Practice, and then tell us a little bit about how this report came to be and some of the highlights in there.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Martin. So I'm a Chief Operating Officer at Good Practice, and we're an organisation focused on improving the performance of leaders and managers, usually through digital and informal learning means. And we really started the Learning Trends survey after attending the ASTD International Conference in 2010. And we heard about this Learning Executive Confidence Index, where we which gave a really interesting snapshot about the expectations of senior L&D professionals in the US for the following 6 months. So we came back from that wondering if there was something similar for the UK market, and there wasn't. And so because we were interested, we decided that we wanted to capture that information ourselves.
So in this particular survey, what's that telling us about 70-20-10 and informal learning?
So with 70-20-10, we really wanted to find out whether the buzz that you hear at conferences and on blogs and on social networks was translating into actual change on the ground. And the main sort of driver behind that was because we'd previously found that with mobile, lots of people were talking about mobile learning, but very few professionals who actually work in organisations were experimenting with mobile solutions. So the question that we had was, well, is this also true of 70-20-10? And the long and short of it is that if 70-20-10 is a fad, it's certainly a deeply entrenched one. The vast majority of senior L&D people have heard of 70-20-10. It's something like over 90%. And almost half of those people say that they are actively using the framework to help them with their learning provision in their organisations. So that sounds good for 70-20-10, but when you dig a bit deeper into the numbers, it starts to look a little less clear about how this is working in practice. One of the questions that we also ask learning leaders is whether they have a strategy to support informal learning in their organisations, and that, it's a fairly blunt description of the 70 part of 70-20-10, but it's useful to understand. And the result for that question was that 76% of professionals don't have a strategy to support informal learning. So on the one hand, how can almost half of organisations be using 70-20-10, but 76% don't have a plan for how they're supporting informal learning? And we actually got a nice email from Charles Jennings about the report. And I think Charles is probably someone who's done more than any other person to promote 70-20-10. And he picked up on that very point, saying that there's a lot more work to be done to encourage people to see that 70-20-10 is more about supporting social and informal learning than it is about creating more multimedia variations of very structured learning.
Yeah. So, are there any other paradoxes in your report? So you've got the 70-20-10. I think that's a lovely kind of learning paradox, isn't it? We're saying one thing about it and we're doing something completely different, it would appear.
So one of the questions that we asked this year was around what tools and practices organisations are using to support on-the-job learning for their leaders and managers. Now, I'll put my hand up and say there's an obvious area of self-interest here because that's right at the heart of what Good Practice does. But we think that the results are of interest to everyone working in L&D. And one standout result from that question was the extent to which online communities are being leveraged by L&D departments to support on-the-job learning. So almost 60% of organisations have some form of online community, but only half of those organisations, or half of L&D professionals in those organisations, were actually actively working to make those communities places where managers could get support, on demand, if it will. And I guess there's no doubt that online communities can and do develop on their own, but there's this huge potential for L&D to nurture them and provide managers with more timely support for their on-demand needs. So I thought that was interesting, that there was this big untapped potential that was waiting there for L&D professionals. And I think some of the reason why that's not necessarily been leveraged comes out from the results of other surveys, like the LPI's capability matrix, which suggests that supporting social collaboration is maybe a skills gap for the profession.
Sure. So from the 70-20-10 and the communities of practice, we're kind of seeing that there's maybe a gap in the capability of L&D, or in terms of what's being provided, and the hope and the aims of what these things can do. So if you were to have some conclusions from your report in terms of what L&D could be doing, what would they be?
So overall, learning and development has a very optimistic view of the future. They consistently state that our impact on business and our ability to meet learning needs will improve in the next 6 months. Every single report that we've done has had a significant proportion of people saying, yes, it's going to keep getting better. And that's somewhat at odds with some of the messages that are coming from senior business leaders. Now, this isn't something that L&D suffers in isolation. Optimism bias is a well-known psychological bias that affects people in general. And without it, the world would probably be a much gloomier place than it is. But it is something that can stop us from taking a realistic look at how we're doing in general. But fortunately, there's stuff that we can do about this. So there's stuff that we can do about 70-20-10, there's stuff that we can do about online communities, and there's stuff that we can do about our overall practice and forging forward. So we need to consciously look at evidence about our performance in an objective and unbiased way. So creating structures and routines where we regularly do that is one thing that L&D professionals can do. We need to build into our processes time for regular reflection and review, but also to look outside our own department and profession to look at and see what are other people doing, and are we really improving at the rate that we're seeing maybe some of the highest performers are doing. When I look at some of the things that Andrew Jacobs had done at Lambeth and that Shackleton Jones is doing at BP, I think they're those are some things that can be aspired to. And finally, I think we need to take proactive steps to assess our own skill sets and ask ourselves if we're doing as much as other domains are to adapt to new ways of working. And that reflective practice, that reviewing what we're doing and how we're doing it, and a constant strive for improvement, I think there's huge potential there for learning and development as a whole.
Great, Owen. Really good insights there from the report, and some great steps as well. Now, where can anyone get the report from if they would like to? Is it downloadable from your site?
It's downloadable from the site, or you can drop an email to support@goodpractice.com, and it will be picked up by one of the team, and they'll get a copy either mailed out or emailed out to you.
Owen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin.